Hello, everybody. Welcome to Shannon Q. I am Shannon Q, and I am very excited today to have a discussion with the author of this book. We're going to talk to Mark Solms today about consciousness. And I know everybody doesn't want to hear me yammer on. If you're new to the channel, welcome to the channel. And we discuss complex conversations and psychology and philosophy here. So I'm very excited, and without further ado, I'm going to bring my guest on screen. Hello, Dr. Solms. Nice to meet you. I'm so excited to talk about this book. For anybody who isn't familiar with you, they'd be silly not to be. But just in case they aren't, do you mind just giving a brief introduction of who you are and where they can find you and what your book's about?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Who am I?
Who are you?
You need
Philosophically.
to pull up a couch and let me lie down on it and speak for 50 minutes.
Well, we're in the right spot.
I'm a professor in neuropsychology. I also unusually for a neuroscientist. I trained in psychoanalysis, which I did in London, but I live in Cape Town in South Africa, which is where I'm talking to you from now.
Yeah, and you wrote this book. So this is what we're here to talk about today. It's called The Hidden Spring. If you're interested in purchasing it, you can buy it. It's in the description. I would strongly recommend it. It's a great book. It is dense in places, but it's a theory of consciousness. If it wasn't dense in places, you wouldn't be doing your job, I don't think, in trying to explain how consciousness relates to neuroscience and neuroanatomy, and specifically the brainstem. And I spoke to you briefly before this, and I had an aha moment as I was reading through the book and listening to some of your talks and listening to the book. I've been kind of consuming it for a month and a half, just trying to take a lot of it in. There's some dense stuff related to, we'll get into that, but let's see if I can sort of succinctly give you my understanding of the book and where my aha moment came in. I've always studied neuroscience and psychology, and I'd been focused because I studied cognition on, logic processing and perceptual processing and the cortices. And it just never dawned on me that that may not be sort of the seat of consciousness, that it may be more affective, and it may be our feelings that kind of drive consciousness, and that our logic centers and how we perceive may be a layer on top of that necessary scaffolding, and that we are just kind of being misdirected because of, I don't know, maybe our centric view of how our logic and reason kind of defines us as that being what the important part is. And when the aha moment for me was, because I studied perception, I was familiar with the reticular activating system because when I studied, mechanoceptors and nociceptors and physical, like tactile perception, and it always bothered me a little bit that like something like I think 70 or 80% of that terminates there before you're even aware of it. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of weird that, so there's something that's not me deciding something about what I'm perceiving. And reading this, it kind of made sense to me. Oh, okay, well, I mean, that's where all of that is springing from. So, and as somebody who studied cognition, in communication, and it always kind of bothered me that there was this sort of very methodical, mechanical way of looking at the brain, and we sort of divorced emotions for the most part from processing, where it was clear that they had an effect on processing and on our conceptualizations of us. So putting feeling at the base just never had dawned on me, and I had never related it to the brainstem and lower cortical midbrain structures and structures surrounding the brainstem until I read this, and it was just like, yeah, So, do you think that that's? I mean, it's not very thorough, but those were my aha moments reading. Is there anything you feel as though I left out that's important to mention relating to your book before we get into? I want to talk about homeostasis. I want to talk about affect.
No, I think that you have started with the pivotal issue. I mean, that really is the correct place to start. I would just point out,
Okay.
in case there's any misunderstanding,
Sure.
that it wasn't on the basis of any kind of a priori assumption that feelings matter more than cognitions, or that, you know, we've neglected feeling. Let's see what happens if we start from there. It really it is an empirical matter.
Yes.
The empirical matter is that you can damage just a tiny area of the reticular brainstem, basically the size of a match head, and that obliterates all consciousness. Conversely, you can have huge cortical lesions, and most tellingly, you can have no cortex at all, and still consciousness persists. So there's a massive asymmetry between the cortex, the seat of our cognitions, and the brain stem, in that tiny lesions in the brain stem obliterate consciousness, and massive lesions, in fact, total destruction of the cortex does not. So that alone suggests we've been looking in the wrong place. You know, why look to the cortex if there's this what I've just termed the massive asymmetry between the two? Then, when you look at what the brainstem is doing, you realize that you learn from all sorts of, again, empirical points of view, that what it's doing is generating feelings, what are technically called affects. Oh, you asked me if there's anything you've left out. Perhaps I should also just clarify.
Yes, please.
The word emotion is not, emotions are not synonymous with affects. Emotions are a subset of affects.
Okay, that's fair.
Affect is a broader term. It includes all sorts of feelings, including very simple feelings like feeling hot or feeling thirsty, or feeling sleepy, and so on. So it's feeling in that very general, elementary sense that I'm talking about. That's what's generated by those brainstem structures, which, when damaged, lead to a total wipeout of consciousness. So it was that made me think, well, that must be the foundational form of consciousness. And then it's a business of unpacking all the implications that flow from that.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, I'll try to be more careful with my wording. I think I see them as synonymous in language. So perhaps that's a good correction. I appreciate it. So that I'll try to be careful with my wording going forward. So,
well, you know, it's not an uncommon error, but it does lead to all sorts of confusions. You know, the dawn of consciousness, it is not human consciousness. When consciousness first evolved on Earth, it took the form of the kinds of things I was just talking about. Very simple feelings of a creature feeling hungry, or feeling pain, and so on. Emotions are a higher form of affect, and then cognitive consciousness is an even higher form by far than emotion.
So you see the feeling. I'm gonna try to divorce the two, because it is important for that. That is an important distinction specifically for this discussion. So you see feeling kind of as the base, and everything else builds upon it. Is that fair to say?
Yes, you know, a crucial point, just going back to those foundational points that I made about the asymmetry between the brainstem and the cortex. A crucial point here is that the cortex can, in fact, do all of its cognitive work without being conscious. Cognition is not intrinsically conscious. And that's the other reason to wonder, you know, whether we haven't started in the wrong place. And in fact, this is the basis of the critique, the famous critique that David Chalmers came up with, of all of our neuroscientific attempts to understand consciousness. He said, but, you know, the mechanisms of cognition don't require consciousness to do their work. That it seems as if consciousness is superfluous to cognition. And in a manner of speaking, that's true, although there's an important way in which it's not. But consciousness is certainly not superfluous to feeling. You can't have a feeling without feeling it. There's no such thing as an unconscious feeling.
Right.
And so it really does change the whole game. And the reason I'm so pedantic about words is that I believe, for reasons that no doubt we'll get to talking through, I believe that we feel our way into our cognitions. That's how we become conscious of these things like vision and hearing and whatnot, all of which can in fact go on in the dark. By the way, forgive me for this bright light shining on my face. It's the time of day when the sun streams in through a window in this room, but it doesn't last for long.
You're okay. You're absolutely fine. So I think that that's a good opportunity for us to talk about homeostasis, because I found that that was a really interesting aspect of your book, because you weren't just talking about how feeling is sort of the base. You talked about how it worked. You even, you wrapped some math around it, which was over my head. So I'm not going to get into that. But when you discussed homeostasis, that resonated with me because it kind of made sense. We're essentially creating maps of predictions of what is within our bounds of good and bad, like where we are and aren't okay. And if something deviates from that prediction, that elicits a feeling, and that feeling is kind of unconscious but is brought into our consciousness, and that feeling relates to getting us back within those bounds. So that's where the homeostasis comes in. You can probably do a much better job of explaining it than me, but that was my, I guess, layperson understanding of it. And it seemed to make sense to me that, yes, of course, like emotions do, or feeling, sorry, I'm gonna do this all the time. I'm gonna do this the whole time now. I'm so self-conscious about it. So feeling is doing work, and it's doing work to keep us within reasonable bounds of where we are okay and within our predicted states based on the kind of unconscious maps we have for what is and isn't okay, based on perception, based on feeling. And anyway, can you elaborate on that and explain it far better than I did?
Yeah, well, I don't think I can explain it far better, but I can clarify some points and elaborate on some of the points you've made.
Okay.
Perhaps the starting point of what I'm going to say should be that when you said feelings do work, a famous argument, in fact, it starts with David Hume, is that consciousness does no work. And he roots it in the observation that if you swapped in the color spectrum, red with green, and if everything that currently looks red, or everything that looks red to you, let us say, looks green to me, it would make no difference. We would both call that quality red or green. What you call red, I would call red, but I would actually be experiencing what you would call green. Hume makes the point that makes no difference. So there's no causal consequence of consciousness. It doesn't do anything. And that has all kinds of really spooky implications. The most frightening one being that consciousness therefore exists outside of the causal matrix of the universe. It's just some epiphenomenon that's just there, not doing anything, which doesn't quite square with my experience, and I suspect with all of our experience. It seems as if it makes a difference, what we're experiencing. And let me rephrase it, it makes a difference what you feel. So, you can't swap, a feeling of delicious joy with a feeling of excruciating pain, and it makes no difference, because pain impels you to do something, namely to withdraw from the noxious stimulus. And that's different from what delicious joy impels you to do, which is to look for more of the same. And that leads to what you were saying about homeostasis, that feelings evolved in tandem with those things which predict our survival, and those things that predict our demise. So that if you are moving outside of your viable temperature range, you feel too hot or you feel too cold, and this tells you this is bad for you. You must do something about it. You need to correct that that you have to remove that feeling. You have to reverse it. And good feelings, pleasurable feelings, all of them, what they tell the organism, what they convey to us living things is, yes, this is good. You're heading in the right direction. You're heading back to your homeostatic settling point. So that is to say, the range that is viable for your continued existence. And bad feelings mean the opposite, that you're heading away from where you need to be. And if you carry on in that direction, it's going to be the end of you. So that is the causal work that feelings, what causal effects they have on behavior. Now, I need to clarify that the predictions that you refer to are predictions as to what we must do about this. So the feeling, in a manner of speaking, is the demand for work. And then what we do is the work so demanded. And we are born with predictions, if I can use the technical term. We are born with predictions as to what we must do in these biologically imperative situations. But those predictions that we're born with are too simple. They're necessarily simple because they're generalized reflexes and instincts that always apply.
Right.
So, but depending on which context you're in, exactly what to do varies. And so this is the essential thing that feeling allows us to do. Feeling, you can feel your way through what you're doing. So if the reflex or the instinct, the automatic prediction doesn't reach the desired outcome, in other words, the resolution of the removal of the negative feeling, you now have a mechanism whereby you can make choices. The feeling tells you, yes, carry on doing that. That works over and above what's the prediction that's built into the system. It feels here and now whether things are getting better or worse for you. And on that basis, you make voluntary actions. You make choices, which is what voluntary action is rooted in. And choices must be rooted in a value system. And that value system is feeling, where negative feelings are bad and positive feelings are good, ultimately rooted in the sort of basic laws of natural selection, you know, of how and why we survive. So I'm just wanting to separate out these two aspects of the thing. The one is the feeling, which drives behavior, and then the behavior itself, which depends upon predictions as to how do I get rid of these bad feelings? How do I increase these good feelings? And we can learn from the experience, and then we lay down new predictions. And this is how learning from experience, the emphasis is on the word experience. We learn from how things feel. We repeat what feels good, and we avoid what feels bad, and not only instinctually and reflexively, but also on the basis of what knowledge we've acquired through the living of our lives.
So it would be better to say, instead of feelings do work, feelings elicit work? Would that be a better way of looking at it?
Yes, feelings demand work.
Okay. Demand, yeah. Okay. More to the point. Okay, so my next question for you would be, what would you say to somebody, because this is something that I encounter quite frequently, who says, well, obviously, like, feelings are kind of an unconscious thing, and what you do about it, you know, that work that you decide to do, that's what consciousness is. And that they're somehow segregated in some way. And consciousness, like what it is to be you, is how you choose to deal with those feelings, and not a product of, or a byproduct of the feeling itself. Like, that's the thing that happens to you, but the you is segregated.
Now, look, there's no final court of appeal that decides how we must use words. You know,
I don't know. If you do have the internet, it seems like there might be. Sorry, go ahead.
There is a real problem with, you know, the word. What people mean by consciousness varies a great deal.
Okay.
And I think it's no surprise that mostly what people mean by consciousness is this experiencing of myself in the world. It's the perception of what's going on around me. This is why we started our quest for the neural correlate of consciousness by looking at cortical vision, because cortical vision and the other extraceptive senses, hearing and somatic sensation and so on, they so dominate our experience. But remember the point I made earlier. That kind of consciousness is contingent upon brainstem arousal. And brainstem arousal simply is feeling. And as I said earlier, and I'm happy to unpack the statement, there's oodles of experimental evidence that demonstrates brainstem arousal just is feeling. That it has a quality and a content, and that quality and content is what we call affect or feeling. So although it's true that your everyday awareness is dominated by extraceptive perceptions, mine is too, and thank God for that. It's not unimportant
right.
What we're doing in the world and feeling our way through how it's working. But all of it is driven by these affects. That's also why I wanted to correct your use of the term emotion at the beginning, because remember, we're not just talking about emotions. We're talking about feeling in general. So, the subject, sentient being, is literally constituted by feeling. First and foremost, you feel something, and then you feel that something about what's happening. And so it's correctly directed toward what's happening. What is the context of this feeling? What's causing this feeling? What can I do about this feeling? Everything that matters to us flows from that. Are things going well? Are they going badly? Am I right? Am I wrong? Is this good? Is this bad? But the fundamental driving force of it all is affect, and it's not unconscious. It simply isn't. But again, forgive my focus on words. There are things that are very closely related to feelings, which are unconscious. And so let me distinguish between the terms feeling and need.
Okay.
A feeling is a felt need, but your needs are going on all the time, not all of them consciously. So let me give an example. You are constantly burning up your sugar supplies deposited in fatty tissues, and that's what's providing you with the juice to be able to do everything that you do. It's absolutely fundamental. But that's not hunger. You don't feel it. It's an autonomic reflexive process just going on automatically. It becomes a feeling when you get hungry, which is a demand on you to do something over and above this automatic business of burning up, sugar supplies. Then you are driven to look for energy sources in the outside world, and that feeling we call hunger. So the distinction between the two, need and feeling, is important, because you have all of these needs constant, like breathing. You're not aware of the need to breathe. It's happening automatically. But enter a carbon dioxide filled room and you suddenly feel what we call suffocation alarm, and then it dominates your consciousness. And that transition from autonomic need to feeling makes a difference. This is why I was saying earlier, that the crucial thing about feeling is that it has causal power. It impels the organism to do something, which is not present when it's not felt. I'm busy giving a lecture.
No, I love it. That's why you're here. Nobody, people can listen to me talk. No,
I was going to use an illustration. I was going to say, I'm busy giving a lecture. While I'm doing so, my bladder distends.
You used that example.
Yeah. But only when the lecture's over do I become aware of I need to go. I need to urinate.
The urgency lands upon you.
It's there all the time. Yeah. And then it enters consciousness, and that makes a difference to what you do. So when people say, well, most of my affects or emotions or whatever they're referring to go on unconsciously, they're referring to that, to the fact that most of these things are being regulated automatically. They are, to the extent that they can be. But then there's this crucial transitional point where something needs to be done of the kind that cannot be done automatically. And that is when you're uncertain about, what shall I do now? How do I relieve this need? And then you have to make choices. And that's what feeling is for.
So feeling is a way to compel us to do things that can't be done automatically, that we require for survival. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I would put it like this. You only need to feel those things for which you do not have an automatic prediction, automatic solution as to how to meet the need. If there's not an automatic, automatized, stereotype, way of dealing with it, then you have uncertainty, and you have to make choices. And feeling enables us to make choices by telling us here and now whether this is going better or going worse for me. That's what feeling enables. It enables us to if in creatures that don't have feeling, they just automatically do what ants do, and then if it doesn't work, they die. And they're very large numbers of ants, and so the ones that do the right thing, by chance, they're the ones that reproduce, and so the next generation has a new skill built into them. Mm-hmm. But what we have as sentient creatures is really a massive adaptive advantage over that, which is that we don't have to pass on our bad or good choices to the next generation. We can make choices here and now in our own lifetimes, learn from the experience, and adjust. And this enables us to live longer, to put it at its plainest, but to live in unpredicted environments. We can live in environments for which we have no innate preparedness, and then we can sort of suck it and see, as they say. We can make it up as we go along, and find a way of managing in environments that were not predicted by our evolutionary history. And there are a hell of a lot of those. The world is a very uncertain place.
And not for nothing, we also have this memory system that allows us to not just relate to our own experiences, but be able to perceive and understand the relation between how other people's experiences may affect us if we make similar choices. So I think that's not for nothing as well, because it's not simply just, from my perception, I guess, it's not simply just trial and error on our own part. It's we have the ability to perceive what other people are doing and kind of take that on board as, yes. That person jumped off that cliff and they died. Maybe I should probably not do that. Yeah. You know what I mean?
And there's something in between the two extremes that you've just mentioned. Mm-hmm. The one of trial and error, mm-hmm. And the other of learning from the experience of others, mm-hmm. Which can also be communicated verbally. Yes. That's the highest sort of level that we humans are capable of, and again, thank God for that. Mm-hmm. But in between those two extremes, there's also the capacity for thinking, which is an experimental sort of acting, by which I mean virtual action. It's acting in an imagined environment, and you can feel your way through those virtual environments in just the same way as we feel our way through real world environments. So thinking saves lives. Trial and error is a dangerous business by comparison with thought, where the consequences are just little signals rather than actual falling off cliffs.
Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the neuroscience in the book. I'm a little bit of a brain nerd, and I'm kind of really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you directly about it. So I'm going to geek out for a little bit. So the lady that had I'm probably going to get this wrong. My memory is not that great this morning with just the one T in me. It's early here. So I can't remember exactly why she had this take place, but they misplaced they were trying to stimulate an area of her brain, and instead of stimulating the appropriate area, I completely forget what the appropriate area was, they accidentally stimulated the reticular, like a nuclei in the reticular activation system. And she immediately went into this deep depressive state that once the stimulation stopped and they got the right area, she went into a hypomanic state. Like it almost like she bounced in the opposite direction. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, do you feel as though, one, can you kind of explain that to the audience and why it's relevant? And two, do you feel, just this is me personally being curious, that that was kind of like a rebound from a homeostasis perspective, where her brain was like, oh, this is really wrong, we need to overcompensate in the opposite direction?
Yep. So thank you. That's a case published by Blomstedt.
Yeah.
And it's a 65-year-old woman
Yeah.
Who suffered Parkinson's disease, and importantly, who had no psychiatric history. She'd never suffered from depression or any other psychiatric trouble. And Blomstedt's team, as is common these days, put an electrode into the subthalamic nucleus. And what it does, a high voltage stimulus blocks nervous activity. So it actually shuts down what the subthalamic nucleus normally does. And this improves the movement disorder of Parkinson's disease. It changes muscle tone, basically. This part of the brain is a small place. And so the electrode went just a few millimeters too deep. In fact, these electrodes have multiple nodes. So you can also stimulate at different points along the electrode. But the end of the electrode was meant to be in the subthalamic nucleus, and it went deeper into a part of the reticular activating system called the substantia nigra, which just means the black substance. That is crucial for the production of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. So when the electrode was switched on, what it did was it shut down dopamine. And within 5 seconds, she was in a profound depressed state, literally suicidal. She didn't want to live. Then alarmed, they switched the electrode off. And within 30 seconds of switching off the electrode, she was in, as you say, a hypomanic state. And then it settled back to normal. So what that was a dopamine surge, exactly as you described it, a rebound of the substantia nigra now coming back into play. And just as we were describing earlier how affects work, a deviation from where your dopamine level needs to be feels bad. So the demand is, to go back to where you need to be, but she couldn't go back to where she needs to be because the substantia nigra was being blocked. So the neurons that produce the dopamine couldn't do so. That excrete dopamine, there was no dopamine being released, and so she was stuck in that awful state until the substantia nigra came back online, which took about 30 seconds. And then there was this massive rebound, a dopamine surge. So that is exactly what, as you surmised, that's exactly what explains what we saw. But there are two further things I want to say about this. The one is, our audience knows that this patient very generously agreed to then have the surgeon try again without her knowing whether the substantia nigra or the subthalamic nucleus was being stimulated, because they moved to a higher node to be able to stimulate in the correct place. And so she doesn't know which node is being switched on, but whenever it was in the substantia nigra, she went back into the suicidal depression. And whenever it was in the subthalamic nucleus outside of the reticular activating system, then she did not feel depression. So I just wanted to make clear that this wasn't some chance observation. It was something which could reliably be reproduced once it had been discovered. But I also wanted to take the opportunity to make the point that this is the sort of evidence I was referring to earlier, when I said that we have very good experimental reason to believe that what the reticular activating system is generating is feelings. That's a stark case where you switch what a reticular activating system is doing, a nucleus is doing off or on, and it makes you profoundly depressed or slightly manic. And this is a direct demonstration of the process. And then you spoke about math earlier. The mechanism we're talking about.
When you were talking about self-organizing systems, or I'm probably saying that incorrectly. And
it does become complicated, but the point is, Shannon, that it's not homeostasis. What I've just described.
Well, that's fascinating because you can actually write logic around it, and it retain. That's what was compelling to me. I can't say that I fully understand it. I'm working on it, but the fact that you can literally write out the physics of this and make predictions based on writing out the physics of this, of like what somebody's state is going to be based on the feeling. You can make predictions that follow that logic. That's very compelling. Like it's difficult to ignore that, even if I don't fully understand it. I guess I am trusting that it's the case, but that's compelling, right? Because being able to make predictive models is, what you're looking for when we're talking about the material source of consciousness, and it's right there.
Yeah.
Sorry,
look, there are two important things that flow from what you've just pointed out. The one, I want to go back to what I said earlier about David Hume and color, red versus green making no difference.
Yeah.
There's another whole story. I don't know if you know the story about the visual neuroscientist Mary, who knew everything that there was to know about vision and its mechanisms. But just to simplify the story, it's actually a horrible long story, but to simplify it, let's just say she was blind. She was born blind. Mm-hmm. So even though she knew everything there was to know about the mechanism of vision, all of the physics and physiology of how visual impulses, are generated by light waves falling on the retina and how they're propagated up the optic nerve and, all how these different information processes. Because she had never seen anything, she didn't know what it is like, what the conscious quality of redness and greenness are. And then, thank God, one day the gift of sight is bestowed on her, and then the point is made. Then she suddenly learned something utterly new about vision, something which was not predicted by its mechanism. In other words, again, the argument being that the causal mechanisms of cognition do not explain or predict what consciousness is like. And the first point that I wanted to make in relation to what you've just said is that by being able to reduce feelings to the causal mechanisms of homeostasis, there we can show that those mechanisms do actually predict. The whole point of those mechanisms is to make us feel something, to feel good or to feel bad. This means that you can, in fact, insert feeling, the most elementary form of consciousness, into the ordinary causal matrix of things. In other words, it's not something spooky. It's not something that exists outside of the rest of nature. It is something that can be accommodated within ordinary physical science. So that's the first point. The second point is kind of more wild, which is that
bring it.
If you're going to claim that you have identified the causal mechanism whereby feelings come about, then you should be able to engineer them. If you really, the brilliant physicist Richard Feynman said, if you can't create it, you don't understand it. If you really know how something is made, then make it, show us. And so that's, for me, that is the absolute critical test of whether or not we really have now accommodated feelings within the ordinary causal matrix of natural science. We should be able to engineer an artificial feeling system. That's the critical test.
Oh, did you now you have me thinking about AIs, and I don't know how it would be possible to create the same sort of material construct that's required, or at least seems to be required, really, based on what I understand, which admittedly isn't much, I guess, but the material system required to elicit our feelings is we couldn't just construct that. What if that is within the bounds of necessity for feelings, is this sort of organic material? How could we construct that?
Yeah.
Is that a fair thing to think that we could do?
Yeah, so I want to first of all disclaim that we are going to anytime soon be able to engineer anything like human consciousness.
Yeah.
We are talking about very simple artificial feelings, a system that feels its own needs and acts accordingly.
Okay.
But the point that you are making about, well, surely it has to be something organic, is a very interesting point. There's let me do it this way.
Okay.
The brain is made of neurons, as is the spinal cord. The elementary building blocks of the nervous system are neurons.
Yeah.
These are the organic things that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Neurons are the vehicles of neurotransmission, the producers of neurotransmitters, etc. The things that are connected together by synapses. This is the basic organic stuff of the organ of the mind.
Right.
Now, we're not talking about thought experiments here. We're talking about actual existing technology. There are pyramidal neurons which go from the cortex down to the spinal cord, which make movement of limbs possible. And it has been experimentally demonstrated, in fact done, that monkeys with severed pyramidal cortico-spinal pyramidal neurons, who are therefore paralyzed in the limb that's innervated by those neurons, that you can send a radio signal from the cortex to a receiver in the lower spinal cord, which then enables the monkey to move its limb again. In fact, not just move it in some kind of jerky fashion, the monkey can walk again. A paraplegic monkey can walk again on the basis of this radio signal, which is doing the same job as the pyramidal neuron. You see the point. So it's the information that is transmitted, the message from the cortex to the spinal cord. The very same message can be communicated by an artificial something that replaces the neuron, something that does the same work as the neuron.
Would that have the same sort of like affect with regard to feeling, though? Like that seems as though you can elicit a mechanical process where
So I wanted to make that point to start with, just to say that we can, you can replace the work done by a neuron with something artificial. Okay. Now, the pyramidal neurons, by the way, are rather extraordinary things. They are cortical neurons, which do all of the predictive coding that you just touched upon earlier. The prediction neurons and the error detecting neurons in the cortex, which are fundamental to our cognition, are pyramidal neurons. They're found in abundance in the prefrontal cortex and in the hippocampus. Although the neuron I just spoke about was a corticospinal one, it is the same type of thing as we use as the vehicles of our cognition. Now bear with me one more step.
Okay.
Imagine we know that the brain is made of neurons.
Yep.
That we know that the brain thinks and feels and does all of this gymnastics that you and I are capable of, the mental gymnastics we are capable of. So here's a thought experiment. You take a human brain. We can't actually do this, but that's why it was important for me to tell you we can actually. And you take out one pyramidal neuron and replace it with an artificial one that does the same job as that neuron.
Are we talking like a ship of Theseus, only a human brain? Is,
Yeah,
is that what we're talking about? Right? That's actually
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
scary to me. So you're saying
yeah.
hypothetically, if ethically there was no constraints, we
Mm.
could theoretically use the same sort of process that we did to move a monkey's leg to get them to even be able to control their own leg is probably a better way to put it. And do that in as this sort of ship of Theseus, like when you keep replacing planks, when is it a new boat sort of manner, and
Yep,
replace our neurons one at a time with a,
exactly.
oh, that I don't, I'm not gonna sleep
And
tonight
you
now,
must
Mark.
remember that that's what's
I'm
going
not gonna
on.
sleep.
That's what's it goes on naturally in us. Our cells are dying and regenerating all the time. We are constantly, we are such ships ourselves.
How do you know you
So,
don't lose something in the way of, like, now we're way off your book. I'm sorry, but like, how do you know you don't lose something in the way of experiential affect? Like, how do you know that there's not a difference in quality in your experience of the world or yourself as that starts to accumulate? Like, do you reach a point of diminishing returns where this is no longer a viable way? Like, you could do it in a small section potentially, but not like full throttle all the way down.
I'm sort of regretting that I've gone down this path with you, because our audience will lose all confidence in me.
No,
Uh,
they will not. Don't you dare. This is an interesting conversation. Once they read your
I
book.
think in principle, if you follow the logic of the thought experiment, if you replace one neuron at a time, each time that neuron is doing the same work that the biological neuron is replaced by an artificial neuron, and it does the same thing, then but what you're, I think, intuitively touching upon is, the reality, which is so far removed from that thought experiment,
Yeah.
which is that the actual, infinitely nuanced connectivity of our individual neurons, yours versus mine, represent your remembered life versus my remembered life, and so on. So there's an incredible individualization. And it's not just a matter of a Lego set of neurons. They have each neuron connects to lots and lots and lots of other neurons, and so the idea of actually being able to replace the neuron and then weighting the synaptic connectivity exactly the same as it actually is impossible. I don't believe it's possible. In practice, in theory, the principle holds.
It's an interesting thought. It's something that I'm going to be thinking about for a while, actually. So I appreciate you bringing it up. Sorry, I'm a naturally inquisitive. So when I hear something interesting, I go down rabbit trails, and that's fascinating. Okay, I want to get back to your book because we haven't talked about the periaqueductal gray, the PAG, and how it relates. And I would love some elaboration on where that comes into play. We've talked about the reticular activating system, and I think it's important to mention too, and I don't know that either of us have brought it up. We've talked about perception and we've talked about feeling, but when we're talking about neurology, like when we're talking about the components of the brain and the brainstem, it's not for nothing that perception, like any sort of exterior perception or exteroception that we have, isn't just processed cognitively. It's processed, like in the cortices, it's processed by way of the brainstem, particularly as I mentioned, like when we're talking about tactile responses and pain, and visual perception. Those go down to the same sort of nuclei before they enter into our conscious awareness, and we know how we feel about them and how we're oriented towards them. So I think that's an important thing to say as we start to talk about the PAG. So can you talk a little bit about how the PAG factors into your theory in the book here regarding consciousness?
Yeah. Well, let me use the example that you started with, namely pain, which is a happy choice, because that's where we first started.
Love no
Yes, exactly. They are indeed.
Yeah.
But it was through our acquaintanceship with the PAG and how it functions has everything to do with our understanding of pain. A PAG is very important for pain, and in fact, even in a very practical medical sense, you can treat intractable pain with deep brain stimulation into the PAG, and people do, people with chronic intractable pain. So, what we're talking about are not just theoretical constructs. These are things that change people's lives. So what you said about pain, just to convey to everyone exactly what it is that you were referring to, is that the nociceptors, the neurons that respond to tissue damage in the periphery, they send those signals to your brain. And most people think, oh, yep, that goes to my somatosensory cortex, and then I feel pain in my left hand in the part of my cortex that represents the left hand. But that's not true at all. As you said, a small percentage of the fibers go there, and what they do is they tell you where the pain is. They locate the pain on a map of your body, but it is not the pain itself. The affect, pain is an affect. It's a feeling. And the affect of pain is registered in the periaqueductal gray. So the actual homeostatic measure of how much or how little am I deviating from where I need to be in terms of acceptable levels of tissue damage, that feeling is generated in the PAG, and it's located in the cortex as to where this pain is happening, where on the surface of my body is it happening. So the feeling is generated in the PAG. And now what we've just said about pain applies to literally all affects. And this is an astonishingly important fact. And I say astonishing in the sense that how could we have not noticed this before? And, and even when we did recognize this, why didn't we think, well, this is the most important news ever, which is that all of our homeostats, there are multiple homeostats in the body because we have multiple needs. All of them send their residual error signals to the periaqueductal gray, which I'm from now onwards going to call the PAG because it's a long tongue-twisting word. So the PAG is the final destination of all your homeostatic needs. And so we think of the PAG as a meta-homeostat. It's the homeostat that regulates all the homeostats. And remember I spoke earlier about how we have multiple needs and we're not feeling them all the time. They're being dealt with automatically for the most part. And then the most salient one, the one where the greatest uncertainty is as to what's to be done about this, I don't have a ready solution. That decision, if you can call it a decision, the selection of which need is going to be felt is made by the PAG. So the PAG is a need prioritization mechanism. In other words, it's a homeostat that's orchestrating all the homeostats and deciding, which one is going to be, which is going to register on the radar of feeling. Yeah. So it's a descending. Many people think the PAG is part of the reticular activating system, but it's not. In a way, it works. In a way, you could say it's the opposite, because all of the homeostatic error signals descend upon the PAG, so it sort of descend onto the PAG, which then makes the selection, and that in turn leads to the activation of forebrain action struct. What am I going to do about this? That unfolds upwards over our long-term memory systems. I mean, through these instinctual reflexes and so on, but beyond that to what we've learned from a lifetime of experience. And the activation of those sort of sensory motor context, the part of the brain that registers the outside world. So it's, I feel like this about that. I feel like this, what am I going to do about it? That is what the reticular activating system then activates and drives in the way that we were speaking earlier. So it's a kind of, the PAG is where the selection is made, and then it is executed in the forebrain, by our sensory motor, outward-facing brain systems, but the reticular activating system then palpates how you're doing. So this whole sort of thing of, are things going well or are things going badly? The registering of sensory motor error signals and predictions and the balance between the two, all of that is modulated by these basic arousal systems of the reticular activating system. And there are 5 major neuromodulators that do that, and they modulate different aspects of how things are going. And those are dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, as you call it in America. We call it noradrenaline.
I'm Canadian, to be fair.
Apologies.
Don't insult me. Just kidding. Keep going, sorry.
And the other 2 are acetylcholine and histamine. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of palpating the arousal of the forebrain, as it were, feeling your way through. Are things going as expected? If things turn out as expected, that's good. If uncertainty prevails, that's bad. And so this is a modulation, fundamentally a modulation of the balance between outgoing predictions and incoming error signals. And to the extent that your outgoing predictions are matched by what's expected, to that extent, things are going well. And to the extent that error signals are increasing, to that extent, your confidence in your predictions goes down as your confidence in the error signals goes up. And this confidence is a statistical term. How confident are you in this prediction, or how confident are you in this error signal? That is literally what reticular activating neurons code. So the rate of firing of those 5 different types of reticular activating neuromodulatory systems is literally coding increasing or decreasing confidence in these different aspects of the predictive and error registering machinery of the forebrain.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think when I was reading about it, about how it might relate to something like PTSD and getting false positives for anxiolytic external perceptions, and how that seems to be this sort of unconscious process where you may be so used to building this response set where something seems like it's dangerous because it legitimately was at a point in time, and then that response set becomes so like set, and the PAG would, to my mind, probably have a role in that because it's consistently attempting to get us to this sort of homeostatic state, and then once we're outside of that homeostatic state, or the way we orient ourselves towards the stimuli changes, and that might have some sort of manner of subconsciously eliciting it. But that's just me. I think a lot about people with, I'm a mental health advocate, right? Not anything I studied. I'm not a clinician. I was never intending to be a clinician, but it made me think about that and if it might be related. But
yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned PTSD because, because now we get to the domain of emotion, which is, as I said right at the beginning, a subset of affects. These are much more complicated things than hunger and thirst. Yeah. The sorts of things that are at stake now in what you're talking about. Right. So let me take the opportunity to mention that higher in the brain, higher than these reticular systems, reticular arousal systems that I've been talking about, which are the fundamental sort of building blocks of feeling. They are more elaborated and specialized systems. There are, again, classifications vary, but the one that I use, which is the most mainstream one in affective neuroscience, is that of Jaak Panksepp, who identifies 7 basic emotional circuits. And these are not just modulated by those 5 classical neuromodulators I enumerated earlier. Yeah. Each of them has their own exquisitely differentiated neuromodulatory chemistry. And here we're talking about peptides. There are lots and lots of peptides in the brain, and they too are neuromodulators. and they do the same sort of thing. In other words, increasing or decreasing confidence levels, if I must use the statistical term. Physiologically, we call it postsynaptic gain. It's the equivalent sort of thing. It's what those neurons actually do. That they adjust the gain. In other words, they adjust how sensitive a neuron is going to be to an incoming signal.
Okay.
To how sensitive is its responsivity. So the synaptic signal comes in, and then the postsynaptic gain modulates, how sensitive the neuron after the synapse is going to be to the incoming signal. So there are multiple complex neuromodulatory systems, also subcortical, but they're over and above, higher than and more specialized than the brainstem systems we've spoken about. Now, the one of those 7 systems that you're talking about when you mention PTSD is what is called the fear anxiety system.
Like in the amygdala? Is that one of the ones?
The amygdala, yes, there are different nuclei within the amygdala, but there are amygdala nuclei that code and remember, the amygdala is a learning mechanism.
Yeah.
So it's what we've learned is dangerous. In other words, causing. So that's different from pain. It's predicting pain. Yeah. That's what fear is. Fear is an anticipation of pain,
okay.
or other noxious events. And the crucial thing that I'm trying to get to here is that for obvious biological reasons, fear conditioning requires just a single experience. We call it single exposure learning. Now, let me contrast that with, say, attachment bonding, which is mediated by another one of these emotional circuits. You can see why, who am I going to attach to? It can't be on the basis of, well, somebody fed me once, okay, clunk, this is my caregiver forever. You have to see, well, who's reliably looking after me when I cry and I'm hungry and need my diaper changed. Somebody, and that takes 6 months. Human beings attach at roughly 6 months, whereas so it takes 6 months to learn in that emotional system. But in the fear anxiety system, it needs a single event. Because you're lucky you got away with it the first time. You touch a live electrical wire and you learn, wow.
Don't do that.
That's bad. You don't say, well, let me try it again and see if it reliably gives me a shock that I was lucky to survive the first time. So sadly, the single exposure learning mechanism of fear, which is there for good biological reasons, has its downside, which is that fear conditioning is very, this kind of learning is well nigh indelible. It's very hard to undo such a connection once it's been formed. And so, that is exactly as you said earlier, that is what that aspect or that core feature of PTSD it does work in that way. But I wanted to take the opportunity to clarify that this is in relation to a higher level of affect. That's these emotional circuits which are specialized and have their own different ways of learning, depending on which affect you're talking about, and that they are modulated by different chemistries than the basic ones of the reticular activating system.
Oh, this makes me have more. I appreciate the clarification, because it did make me wonder if it played any role. So this is helpful to me. I promise I won't keep you too much longer. I could talk to you probably for hours and hours about this. It's one of my favorite subjects to discuss. So I appreciate you taking the time. There are some questions. So I have one more question that kind of parlays from what we just discussed. When we're talking about how emotions relate to consciousness from a neuroanatomical perspective and a neurological perspective, how is there that interplay between this sort of unconscious eliciting a feeling and how it relates to then our emotional experiences, which I think for most people, like you said, is probably the most important thing. Like how we feel about a thing, like the quality that we give to that thing or that person or that experience that we're interacting with. How do you see those interplay from a physical level? Because I think that that's important when we're talking about the material seat of consciousness.
Yeah. Well, despite the bad press that emotions get, they are very important things. And they are anything but the sort of airy, fairy fluff that people imagine with feelings, like emotions. And let's deal with the real, real tough stuff. Emotions are incredibly, incredibly important. And although they're not biological in the same way as the bodily affects that I spoke of earlier, like hunger and thirst and sleepiness and the need to urinate and all of that, they nevertheless also function homeostatically. So each emotion has a valence. Valence means a goodness and a badness. So deviating from your homeostatic settling point feels bad, and heading back towards it feels good. And that settling point is not a bodily state so much as something rather more complicated. So we spoke of fear a moment ago. That's an emotion. And there's a homeostatic settling point for fear, which is that I am not in danger to life and limb. Oops, this guy's coming at me with a knife. That's a deviation from where I expect to be. That's the feeling of fear, which then modulates, is my escape working or not? It's modulated by, am I feeling relief or am I feeling increasing, anxiety? We spoke also of separation distress, attachment. The homeostatic settling point for that attachment emotion, which, by the way, I spoke about our first caregivers, but as you know, we have attachments throughout life, use the same mechanisms. Let's stick to the first one. The homeostatic settling point is my caregiver is close to hand. Caregiver is available if needed. And then, where is the caregiver? That's a homeostatic deviation. It's an error signal. It's not, this is not where I need to be. And the baby starts to feel panicky and starts protesting and so on. And we, just to remind myself, we're not talking only about babies throughout life, she loves me, she doesn't love me, I need her, I can't cope without her. That is the same sort of separation distress. So these emotions, they serve these very basic biological functions. We mammals are social animals. We need to attach. We can't function by ourselves. We fear. The biological value of that is patently obvious. That it helps you to avoid dangerous situations. Dangerous situations are just that, dangerous. They can lead to your demise. Rage, a third emotion. Think of its biological importance. The homeostatic settling point for rage is there's no object impeding my access to the things that I need. And then this thing's in my way. It's preventing me from getting, I feel irritated until eventually I feel really angry. And then my prediction is attack. And then there's the wonderful feeling of seeing the bastard drop. You got rid of him.
I'm safe now. Yeah.
So, but these are emotions. Sexual lust is an emotion. And play, it may be a great surprise to some members.
Oh, you had a great chapter talking about. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
we need to play, and the biological. I don't want to go on and on.
And it's how we test our bounds too, which is very interesting.
It's how we find our. Yeah, it's. I said that we are social animals, and when I say we, I don't only mean us people. I mean we mammals are social animals, and we live in groups. And those groups, I'm sorry to say, because it's not how I wish it were, it's how it is, they're hierarchically organized. And so how we find our place in the pecking order has everything to do with play. And if you think back to your childhood and get rid of the sentimental idea about play, it's a bloody serious business for children, play. It determines whether, does anybody want to play with me? Yeah. And am I in or am I out? Do I have high or low status within the social group of the jungle of the playground, that we all had to endure? So, the emotions, in short, emotions work in the same way as the simpler affects I spoke about earlier. That is to say, they're homeostatic. And secondly, they are biological. They're important for the survival of the individual, no more or less so than the bodily affects. It's just that it's not here and now, life and death matters. Like I said about fear, I could have said the same about attachment. I could have said the same about rage. If you don't fight for your share, eventually you're going to, you've had it. So all of these emotional feelings play a very important. But I want to add to that learning what the basic types of emotion are is an incredibly important sort of knowledge. For us to understand what the basic emotional values of a human being are. And it's also a wonderful kind of universal thing, that we're all basically the same. We all share basically the same emotional values. Everybody knows it's bad to separate a baby from its caregiver. Everybody knows it's bad to frighten people, etc. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm all for emotion.
Well, another interesting thing that you'd mentioned, I can't remember if it was in the book or in one of the lectures that I was watching that you did, is one of the reasons I think it's so parsimonious is because it really just, from an evolutionary perspective, all vertebrates, they're oriented towards action by feeling of some sort. You said even fish will go to the cocaine, right? Like they have these hedonistic tendencies that they'll look to satiate, despite the fact that from our perspective, our sort of anthropomorphic, like human-centric perspective, we wouldn't see them as conscious, really, because we affiliate consciousness with this sort of higher order cognitive processing and this ability to deliberate and reason over our actions, as opposed to what orients us at its core towards our actions. And we can deliberate as much as we want, but if we have this, like you said, strongly valenced emotional imperative towards something, that's going to override that deliberative capability basically 100% of the time. So that's why I was like, yeah, obviously, like your emotion so inherently affects your ability to reason and so intertwines with your ability to reason that it had to be before it. Like and when you look at other animals and you look at midbrain structures and brain stems and other animals who are vertebrates, the base of our brains, like if you look like from the cerebellum down, like there's not a significant amount of difference until you get to higher cortical structures. I mean, there is a difference, but especially in the autonomic processes, you can go one for one through a lot of brain structures until you get to the higher cortical areas. So yeah, like in order for any sort of vertebrate animal to operate, what must be motivating them, especially since they're mobile, is they need to orient themselves towards something based on feeling a certain kind of way about it. So that had to be the preceding factor. And then we built upon it as we developed higher order cortical structures. And that increased the quality or the type of consciousness that we had. But it wasn't what was consciousness. It's us just adding to, I suppose, the base of consciousness and increasing the quality of that consciousness. So that's what I took from your book. I don't know do you think that's fair?
Oh yes, I'm very pleased you say that you've drawn attention to this part of what we're talking about, because this is one of the major reasons why, as I said earlier, I don't want to take human consciousness as my model example, the most complex form of consciousness.
Yeah.
With the important part that our cortex plays in our consciousness. It can mislead us. It can prevent us from seeing what consciousness in its essence is, which is feeling, which has important ethical implications. Even what you're saying is quite right, that it's sort of a great blow to our narcissism to recognize that our brain stems are pretty much the same as any
pretty
other
basic.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they do pretty much the same stuff.
Yep.
As we can demonstrate experimentally, you referred to the cocaine loving fish. There's every reason to believe that all vertebrates have feelings, have pleasurable and unpleasurable feelings. They're not the same as ours. The emotional circuitry that I spoke of earlier, we humans share with all mammals. So that's something, the basic circuitry of our emotions are the same in all mammals. Now, some of those emotions we share with all vertebrates, not all 7 of them, but we share some of them. And all vertebrates have feelings. They have a periaqueductal gray, which chooses between different needs in relation to what's going on out there, and motivate, the animal on the basis of good and bad feelings, as to what it should do. And I say ethical implications because we eat those things, and worse than that, we on an industrial scale, we breed them so that we can slaughter them and eat them. And here I'm talking about animals that include mammals. I mean, cows and sheep and pigs feature prominently on at least Western menus. And these are creatures which are able to feel separation distress. They're able to feel fear. They're able to anticipate, this is a bad situation. They've got cortex. Vertebrates don't all have cortex. Mammals all have cortex. So they can, they can do this sort of thinking about their feelings thing that we were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. So, yep, it's really important that we recognize that we start with this more basic form of consciousness, and recognize, its place in nature. It has all sorts of implications.
Yeah, so ours may be qualitatively different, but it's foundationally the same.
Yeah.
So I thought that was.
You mentioned 100% of the time. It makes me want to just mention.
What did I do now?
Actually,
did I say emotion again when I meant feeling?
It enables us to introduce the topic of free will, which is so important in relation to consciousness. So you said,
I don't think there is
put
any.
an animal under enough fear, stress, it is 100% of the time going to run away.
Yeah.
But this is one of the differences as we go from the simpler vertebrate brain through mammalian brains to primate brains, to ours, which is a form of primate brain, is that there's increasing degrees of free will. In other words, increasing degrees of capacity to override these feelings. But ultimately, it's probabilistic. So, to use the biblical example of Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel did enter into the lion's den, and I'm sure he was scared, but he went in anyway. But probabilistically, the chances of somebody going into the lion's den is very, very small. So, so the role of feelings in relation to free will is just that. It increases or decreases dramatically the probability that you'll do something. So it's not 100% Daniel went in, but the other 99% of us ain't going to do it.
Well, I mean, we could talk about whether or not I think Daniel actually went in, but
yeah, that's another story.
But fair enough. All right. I'm going to keep you over time and people have some questions. I'm really sorry. You're just really interesting to talk to. So really, this is your fault. So I'm going to start reading some questions. So from Misha Bartlett, thank you for the super chat. Does the sense of self come from the brain stem or is it generated in the cortex? Can you have a feeling without a sense of self? Oh, this might be an opportunity to talk about the encephalitic cases that you brought up in your book, because I think that might be the case.
It's a bit like the word consciousness, but perhaps even more so the word self. It just means different things to different people, and put at the essential issue is they're simple and complex selves, just like there's simple forms of consciousness and complex forms of consciousness. Some people think, that the word self only applies if you have a reflexive awareness that it is me who's having this feeling, and that guy in the mirror is me, and etc. This is the ability to abstract yourself from yourself and look back upon yourself and see, I am an object like other objects. That is a cortical. Not only is it a cortical mechanism, it's a prefrontal cortical mechanism, and it's something that is not unique to human beings, but certainly uniquely highly developed in human beings. This capacity to reflect back upon our mental states, and to reflect upon your mental states from the third person perspective, is one way of describing what a self is. It's a concept that you have of yourself as an object in the world, the object in the world that you happen to occupy. But without going through every possible grade of complexity, you eventually get down to the periaqueductal gray, which just feels things. You don't have to reflect upon pain to feel it, but it is your pain. It is only pain to you because it's yours. The feelings of the kind that we've been speaking about mostly during our conversation, those are feelings, all of them. They're feelings which are subjective. In other words, they apply to a subject. In other words, they apply to a me, even if you don't know it's me who's feeling it. Nevertheless, it is you who's feeling it. And so, there's a subject whose behavior is determined by the feelings. So I would say that the simplest form of self is just feeling. That is the simplest form of a subjective being, even though it can't reflect upon its subjective being. It nevertheless is one. And you mentioned, as I started speaking now, and you anticipated that I was going to mention these kids, and I want to. But there's a condition called hydranencephaly, which is a complicated word for born without a cortex. To say that these kids do not have a self is very hard to sustain when you observe their behaviors and even their personalities. I would go so far as to say that they have personalities, And you talk to the parents of these children, they have relationships with their children. You can't tell them that their children don't have a self because they don't have a third-person abstract concept of their place in the world. So, again, it comes down to very practical matters. What counts as a self? I think that when it comes to the ethics of how these kids are treated, they used to just be left, on the basis of nothing other than the cortical theory of consciousness. Because they don't have a cortex, that means they're not conscious. That means they don't get looked after. And thank God we've gotten over that one. These are, in every sense of the word, they're people. So I think it is important that we don't limit the use of the word self only to our own higher order prefrontal cortical version of it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. All right. So the next question is from Myth Vision Podcast. Oh, you were on his show, actually. You were on Myth Vision Podcast. Could Dr. Solms explain what is causing the religious experience in one's brain? Love this, Shannon. Oh, I love it too. Thank you.
Yeah, so I want to make the point that because I've spoken about the most basic mechanisms of feeling, including the most basic mechanisms of emotional feeling, I don't want to, which is a reductionist job. You know, if you're talking about the basics, you're reducing things to their basics. But that doesn't mean that this level of explanation can account for all of psychological and social life. You know, so I hesitate to reduce to the level of concepts that I'm talking about something as complex as religion. But I would say that I will say two things. The one is that attachment bonding is a very important part of religious experience. A feeling of belonging, a feeling of being at one with, a feeling of being looked over by, you know, a great caregiver in the sky, and so on. I think that that emotion plays a very big part in religious experience. And there's another one, in fact, an emotion we have not yet mentioned in our conversation, which in Panksepp's terminology is called seeking. Different people use different words for it, but it's an epistemophilic drive. In other words, a drive for knowledge, a drive to reduce uncertainty, a drive to know, a drive to be able to predict. And I think that for all sorts of reasons, there's good reason to believe that seeking also plays an enormously important part in religion. But which maybe I should put it in the inverse and say that we cannot bear not knowing. So we fill the void with all sorts of, well, you can call them theories, you can call them fantasies, you can call them delusions if you want to. But I think that that kind of needing to know, even when we don't know, I think plays an important part in religion. Religion deals with questions which are of the utmost existential consequence for us. Like, for example, what happens to me when I die? It's actually excruciatingly panic-inducing to not be able to answer that question, but we can't, because there's no, you know, you got to die first to have empirical evidence about what happens when you die. And so we fill our seeking, the emotion called seeking, fills these, stops these holes with belief systems which are immensely reassuring.
Yeah, uncertainty is a primary anxiety driver. So if you can do something to quell uncertainty and it feels satisfying and it's externally reinforced by especially a large group of people, that's a better state. This might go back to homeostasis as well. That's a better and more satisfying state to be in than that state of uncertainty. So quelling that uncertainty is something that people just are oriented to do, I think, unless they have a reason not to, especially when there's so much external reinforcement. Okay, so there's one more question. This is actually, this is an interesting question. This is from Misha Bartlett again. What about consciousness in highly intelligent invertebrates, like an octopus? Where is the seat of their consciousness, or would you call them conscious? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So there are different ways of approaching this. The first is the one that we've implicitly been following in our conversation, which is that, well, we human beings know that we are conscious. And on the basis of the sorts of evidence that we've been touching upon, we know why we're conscious. In other words, we know what kind of anatomy and physiology you need to be conscious. And that brings us to the vertebrate brainstem and its reticulate core. So we can be confident, just in the ordinary scientific way. You know, you can make predictions. You can say, I know that in my case, you know, stimulating the substantia nigra makes me feel depressed. You know, let's see what happens I predict that if I stimulate this in a fish, the thing is going to look depressed and it's not going to like it, and the prediction is confirmed. So, but you know what to do because, you know where to look. When it comes to cephalopods or any other invertebrate, which have their brains are so different from ours, we can't use that anatomical map as the basis for our formulating of predictions. So we have to have recourse to other methods, and the one that I prioritize is the thing I've said more than once in our conversation, that the essential point of feeling is it enables you to make choices and to come up with voluntary behaviors. In other words, to solve problems on the hoof, problems which are not predicted by your evolutionary past. In other words, novel problems, which you then have to find a solution to. It seems as if this is what feeling is for. It's for voluntary behavior, for adapting to unpredicted circumstances. And certainly, you mentioned octopus. Octopus passes that test, that they are great problem solvers. You can give an octopus a problem that no octopus has ever had before, and it will literally, I use the word very happily, it will think its way through the problem. Thinking rooted as it has to be in a value system of feelings, and they passed that test. I would just say you're less confident when it comes to these creatures. You're less confident because they don't have the same anatomy. But we must be very careful about prejudice. That if it doesn't look like me, then it can't possibly be like me. We're speaking here of consciousness. I would not say because you do not have vertebrate anatomy, you are not conscious. I'll just say if you do have vertebrate anatomy, you are. If you don't, well, it starts to become less certain. And I use these kind of functional criteria, the one that I just mentioned being the main one.
Cool. All right. That was the last question. I very much appreciate you being here. There is a link to buy this book. Guys, buy this book. It's really, really good. And I appreciate you coming to have the conversation. I kept you 6 minutes longer than I said I would because I'm a horrible liar. So if anybody is new here, welcome to Shannon Q. Please like and subscribe and do all the things YouTubers are supposed to say that I'm horrible at. And I'm going to put on my end screen and I am going to say, as I always do, thank you for stopping by. And as always, everyone, help elevate the discourse. Bye.